We're unique. Do you know when Washington wintered at Valley Forge, this is not battle time. They were just hunkered down trying to wait out the winter. Do you know that he lost an average of 10 men a day and no fighting? 10 men a day. They died from dysentery. They died from starvation. And some of them sitting outside, leaning against the wall, with no shoes on, froze to death in the middle of the night. So typically the next morning they'd have a head count. There were minus 10 men. Why didn't they just get up and go home? There was nothing holding them there. You know why. You know why. Because they're like us. They believe in freedom. And they believe that our freedoms came from God, no one else. And that the King of England had no right to restrict our freedoms. They wanted to be Americans, and they're willing to die for it. Here in this room, we are too. But it's becoming something that's even fewer and fewer today. Those men fought and were willing to die for what they believed in. And we owe them a debt of gratitude. We could go on into World War I. Look at the men who fought in the trenches with the gas attacks. How terrible that was. They're fighting out there in the trenches. If you lifted your head above the trench, more than likely you'd get hit by sniper fire. And then the gas came. Guys were dying left and right. They're dying from different diseases down in the mud. Imagine being in the mud in the rain. And what that would do to you and what it would be like living like that for that amount of time. But our boys persevered. They fought on. And we moved forward as a nation. They did the same thing in World War II. How do you fight a war on two fronts, two major conflicts, with two enemies the way we had, without patriots like we had then? It's almost impossible to do that. I often tell a story about a good friend of mine. Her name was Jerry. She was a Pearl Harbor survivor. She wasn't in the military. She was the spouse of a military wife. And I often tell people that's the hardest job in the military. And it is. Tracy, when I was over in the war, was our ombudsman. Jerry and her husband were over in Hawaii, and he had been sent out. He was with the Marines. And I'm going to tell you, this was a long time ago. When he first went into the Marine Corps, they were still using mules to pull the artillery. So he is out on one of the islands, and they had gotten hit pretty hard. But they'd also gotten word that Pearl Harbor had been hit. So to say the least, they were both very worried about each other. Very worried. They didn't know if each other were alive or dead. And I sat there one day with Jerry when the newspaper knocked on her door and wanted to interview her prior to Pearl Harbor Day. And she told this story, and I couldn't help but just sit there in awe. She said when the planes came and the bombing started, she grabbed her children who were small, and she ran to the nearest place she thought she could find shelter, and it was a baseball diamond there on the base. And remember, they had the baseball dugouts that went partially underground. She took her kids, and they hunkered down in that. She had them all huddled up for safety. Meanwhile, a soldier runs by, running to the fight. Because, see, that's what we do. We don't run from the fight, we run to the fight. Even if it means we're going to die. Soldier runs by, and he looks back at Jerry and her children, and he runs, and he just slows until he's just standing there. And she could see him contemplating for a moment. Then he turns, and he runs over to her at a trot. And he pulls out his sidearm, and he hands it to her. He says, "Take this." And her first thought is, what good is that going to do me with all of these Japanese here? But it was different than what she thought. He He handed her that sidearm, and he looked at her, and he said, "Don't let them take your children prisoner. Don't let them take them prisoner." And he turned to run off, and she realized what he was saying. Use that gun on your children before you let the Japanese take them. And to think of what that woman went through, sitting there, thinking about what she might have to do. I just can't imagine. But she pushed forward. They made it out okay. But she is absolutely what I call a picture of American exceptionalism. The kind of people that we are. We don't give up. We don't surrender. In Korea, look at the forces we fought. In the coldest weather I've ever been in my life. I've been to the Arctic, but I have never experienced anything as cold as the weather in Korea. But our boys did it. Vietnam, just the opposite problem. The jungle. The enemies in the tunnels. You never knew where they were going to come from. And the worst part about it is when our boys came home, they came home to a country that spit on them and told them they hated them. Called them every name in the book. But I'm here to tell you today that every one of the men and women who went over there, they're heroes. Every single one of them.